Got it set up.
Thank you, Seth, for coming tonight. The select board had been asked by numerous people about, building in the floodplain, and I kind of felt like there were people were making assumptions about things, and I thought it might be a good idea if we just were all on the same page and understood about, building in the floodplain, and what is the floodplain, and how does it correlate with our zoning, just to, understand it better. So Seth is gonna kind of walk us through his interpretation of that and any new state laws that might be coming down having to do with flooding. I'll just leave it up to Seth.
Right. I think most of you know me. I'm Seth Jensen. I'm the Deputy Director of the Planning Commission. I'm going to give you a brief overview of some basic flood hazard terms. A lot of the flood hazard terms are somewhat confusing and overlapping. So we'll spend some time looking at those. There's a memo handout that outlines the key important ones. We'll then look at the current Wolcott flood hazard district. It's an overlay district within the town's bylaws. And then at the end, we'll talk about some options that are available to communities that choose to regulate more stringently than what is required by FEMA. So to get started and oriented, I think you all recognize this. This front cover is a picture of the day after the July 2023 flood on School Street. Significant flooding on School Street. That flooded in the past. Something I just want to highlight is, because it will come up quite a bit as we're talking. You've all told me a lot about the role that debris at the LVRT bridge played in holding back water and then leading to a flash flood down School Street. That kind of flood event is not captured by the NFIP maps because the maps do not account for debris jams. So, and in Vermont, that also means ice jams. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about that more later, but understand that the maps we have from FEMA are one kind of flooding, specifically inundation, up and down flooding. Flooding from water being impounded or flooding from rivers doing lateral erosion is not seen on the NFIP maps. So there we go. Is that, I guess there aren't people on Zoom right now, so if that doesn't move forward for them, it's not as important. But so we'll start with the important flood hazard terms. And this is really redundant to the memo, but I'll go over them. First, the floodway. Important to know the floodway and the floodplain are not the same thing. The floodway is a specific part of the floodplain, and it is the channel of a river and lanes immediately adjoining the channel that are required to efficiently carry and discharge water during a flood. So if you think about the flood events, often you have the middle of the river and sometimes the banks along the river where water is moving, and then slower inundation at the edges. That water where it is moving is considered the floodway. The floodway fringe is the area at the edge of the floodway where water isn't moving as much. And so combined, the floodway fringe, the floodway and the floodway fringe make up the floodplain. So typically, the floodway is narrower while the floodplain extends out more widely to surrounding flatter areas. There are different size floods and floodplains. And this is where we get into 100-year, 500-year, 10-year. So the 100-year floodplain is the floodplain from a storm that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. So this is where the FEMA terminology gets, I'll let Max field in, gets confusing and a little bit non-descriptive. 100-year storm or 100-year flood does not mean that there's a cycle of these storms happening every 100 years. And that if you live through one, you get to wait another 100 years for them to happen, as you all have experienced, especially in the last 5 years. Think about it more like you have a really big dice with 100 sides. And every year you roll that dice. And if you roll a 1, that means you end up with a flood of that size. And as you know, that can happen, more than once every 100 times. It's just statistic thing. Then the 500-year flood is a larger flood that has a 0.2% chance of happening in any given year. So in that case, it's a really big dice with 500 sides. And then there are other floods. The smaller the number, the more likely that flood is to occur in any given year. So a 10-year flood, it's more likely to occur than a 50-year flood, which is more likely to occur than a 100-year flood. But those floods are also small because there's more likelihood of them occurring. I'm going to pause on that because that is where a lot of confusion in the maps and terminology happens. Does anyone have any questions about that specific terminology? That's great because that's where a lot of people get tripped up on these. Another important term, especially when we get into the regulations, is this term base flood elevation, also BFE. That is water levels during the 100-year flood. So how high the water gets during that 100-year flood event. And all of these, just to take a step back, are based on modeling and statistics that FEMA did back in the 1970s and 80s. So those probabilities are based on data that was available in the 70s and 80s. It does not include the events post that a lot of us have experienced and lived through. So just trying to illustrate this, you'll see this in the memo as well. Understanding floodway, narrow, the channel. The floodway fringe is the area on the edge of the floodway. All encompassing that also includes the 100-year floodplain. 500-year floodplain is bigger because there's more water and more activity happening in the river during those larger storms. Okay. And now we are. Here we go. So I'm going to now take some time to go over Wolcott's current flood hazard regulations. So these are the rules that Wolcott has currently. The regulations can currently be found in section 6.07 of the Wolcott zoning regulations. That section establishes a flood hazard overlay district. So the way an overlay district works is it is additional standards applied on top of your regular zoning districts. So in the village district, people have to meet the rules for the village district as well as the flood hazard rules. In the rural districts, people have to meet their rules for the rural district as well as the rules for flood hazards. It is currently applies to the 100-year floodplain, also known as the special flood hazard area. And essentially, how I would categorize the current regulations are the NFIP FEMA minimum standards, which are standards that towns need to meet in order to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, plus what's called compensatory storage for new structures. And new is in bold and italics because there is specific language about existing and replacement structures that we'll talk about in a minute. But first, I just want to give you a quick overview of what the NFIP minimum standards are. So this is where the distinction between the floodway and the rest of the floodplain becomes important. So FEMA minimum standards prohibit any new structures, fill, and storage within the floodway. Technically, there's a little bit of a caveat there if there's analysis that shows it can be done universally without raising flood elevations by more than a foot, but that's something that the scale of development in rarely is done and rarely it can be done. So new development, however, is permitted in the floodway fringe, subject to the additional FEMA standards and the standards for development within the underlying zoning district. What that means, the big FEMA rule is that the lowest floor of any new or substantially improved structure needs to be elevated above the base flood elevation through use of fill or structural support piers. And so what this shows is that a new structure is being built not in the floodway, but in the floodway fringe, and that is on elevated above the base flood elevation. So elevated above that BFD level. New development in most cases is reviewed as a conditional use when it's a new structure under the bylaws, but the uses and dimensional standards allowed in the underlying district currently are still allowed within the flood hazard area overlay outside the floodway. You do have one piece of the bylaws that goes over and above the FEMA minimum standards, and that's called compensatory storage or no net fill, meaning if fill is used to elevate the structure, an equal amount of fill needs to be lowered elsewhere. Caveat on that is that the bylaws explicitly do not require compensatory storage for replacement structures and elevations of existing structures. So a new structure or structure replacing something that was removed does not need to do compensatory storage under the current bylaws. A new structure does. And so compensatory storage, that means, okay, there's this fill used to elevate the structure. There's a corresponding reduction in removal of fill from the floodplain to make up for the area and reduce the likelihood of fill displacing water onto adjacent properties. Those are the current bylaws. That is a 2-slide synopsis. There's more in them than that, but that's just the broad overview to understand the basics of what you currently require.
What's the definition of a replacement structure?
So that is a good question. And I would say as we get to the next piece of like the options of better defining what is meant by a replacement structure would be, would be valuable.
Okay.
And especially a time horizon of if something is removed, when is it considered a new versus replacement? That could be better defined. Do folks have other questions about the bylaws as they exist at the moment?
Are those, are they just like standard, like that's what we're gonna see if you went to pretty much any other town in Vermont, those would be expectations for the bylaws? Or-
Bylaws do vary from community to community. The options we're gonna talk about, I can try to highlight towns that you might be familiar with who have similar bylaws. I think that, it's, in Memorial County, they're a mix of like the NFIP minimum standards and then, communities that have above code options. So, example, Cambridge, also has very similar regulations to Wolcott. Johnson has just an FIP minimum, no compensatory storage. Village of Jeffersonville, actually has no build, no fill. So it varies. It varies somewhat based on the unique flood dynamics of each community and to some degree the experience of and degree of flooding too. Yeah.
Maxwell has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Maxfield.
Compensatory storage, is that based on square footage or volume in cubic feet?
Volume. Yep. So, we're going to talk about some of these, as well as some of the reasons communities might consider adopting some of them. So the big ones, compensatory storage, which we've talked a little bit about, freeboard, which means additional elevation, a prohibition on new structures or fill, regulation of the 500-year floodplain, and then a process to get to that point of what to do about historic and pre-existing structures. The last thing is a state map hazard for river erosion, which is not currently addressed by the FEMA minimum standards. So something very important, NFIP and the FEMA maps do not account for larger floods. So the FEMA minimum standards are based on that 100-year floodplain. They don't account for storms larger that can occur and do occur. They also do not account for ice jams and debris that might change the flood dynamics in a localized area. One way that communities can provide additional protection is referred to freeboard. It's a nautical term that has to do with ships having measured water and depth. But essentially, what that means is instead of elevating to the base flood elevation, a new or substantially improved structure needs to be elevated at least 2 feet, sometimes more. Some communities require more above base elevation or to the 500-year elevation. So I edited this slide because 2 feet or more, the July 2023 flood in some places was 5 or more feet greater than base flood elevation. So 2 feet was sort of the standard recommendation prior to the 23 flood. There's definitely some discussion about whether that's adequate. And in some cases, some communities are using 500-year flood elevation Some are using 500-year plus one. A very valuable tool that we're going to have in Lamoille County in the next couple of months is the updated model of the Lamoille hydrology that LCPC is working on, and that is going to include some maps and elevations of the flood levels during a 2023 level storm in each of the villages. That if the community wanted to consider, Freeboard might provide some illumination on what would be adequate. And then something, property owners can be eligible for reduced flood insurance premiums by doing this. I said may because NFIP is a federal program set by federal rules, they change. Do you have a?
Yes, the map you guys are preparing for the new floodway through Lamoille.
Yes,
Is that gonna replace the NFIP maps?
that is a really good question. The answer to that question is no, but so only FEMA draws those maps.
They would have to adopt.
They would have to adopt the model. They have paused their adoption process to consider the additional data that has been provided. It's not clear exactly how that's going to play out. We'll say that the work maps that they provided showed flood levels reducing the BFEs 3 to 4 feet lower in Johnson Village than the 1980s maps. So their initial analysis actually showed a flood risk reduction in Lamoille County. After some back and forth over that, it's because they didn't consider new data like the Halloween storm or the 23 storms. So that is why there's a pause and why hopefully they'll consider the modeling data.
But in any event, communities could, I want to say restrict over and above based on your model, regardless of the NFIP.
You could, right, you could. And Freeboard is a good kind of predictable way to do that. That doesn't require you to have a hydrologist for every site. And looking at that, what's the error rate based on the model versus the new maps is a tool you can do to do that. Yeah.
Will the new model include the dynamics of the bridge, of the new bridge?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
That's being, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, do you have a question, Kirk?
No, the thing is, why the level dropped in Johnson, they opened up the stream bed or riverbed below Johnson. They removed a lot of stone, so it opened it up so there's more flow. It was restricted.
I think that they're definitely doing, in addition to the update, they're doing some channel survey to understand things like that. And channel survey is something that can be really important to understand, especially the smaller storms.
They opened it up back around the 75, 76 frame.
Yeah.
Allow more flow through.
Yeah. So that could be showing up. Yes. Yeah.
So the FEMA maps, are they basically maps so that you can get the insurance? And so, and our zoning, is our zoning based on so people can get the insurance, or is our zoning standalone? And how does it work together? I mean,
That's a really good question. So, what drove us? So the NFIP National Flood Insurance Program requires communities to have basic regulations for development of the floodplain. And you need to have those in order for property owners to be eligible for flood insurance. It also impacts communities in reimbursement during and after a major disaster. It is a minimum national standard. You can go above it. You can't go below it. So, and it's very much based on sort of insurance company-esque actuarial thought process, not so much protection of downstream structures or protection of the natural functions of floodplain. It's really, that's really what it's designed for. So when communities want to do those other things, they have these other options to consider.
If a community had so backing up. The feds require us to have basic controls over floodway development. If a community were to have a non-compliant structure, does that mean that only that non-compliant structure might be at risk of not playing by those insurance rules, or does it put all of the development inside of a floodway at risk of not being eligible for FEMA buyouts?
So it depends. So, so you need to have rules and standards for how to deal with pre-existing non-conforming structures. The big thing that FEMA cares about is something I should have included on the important definitions, which is the idea of substantial improvement or substantial damage. And so in any zoning or bylaw or regulation, there's going to be stuff that existed before that doesn't comply. And so one of the trickier things to do is how to figure out when those need to be brought into compliance. And in floodplain world, the trigger is substantial damage or substantial improvement. So substantial damage is when a structure is damaged in a way that it loses 50% or more of its value. Substantial improvement is the opposite, when someone invests in a structure that increases its value by more than 50%. When you do that, you need to bring it into compliance. Now, important piece of this is that we're showing these pictures, the use of fill, assuming a residential structure. There are different rules for floodproofing commercial structures, and then also different rules for structures that are just for storage. So the big example of that would be the Montpelier bus depot, where the area underneath where the buses go is in the floodplain and below base flood elevation, but it's just for buses. And there's housing above that is above base flood elevation. Whether that's a good idea or not is, up to the Montpelier City Council, but that's an example of the different rules for storage and non-residential commercial versus residential on like a single site.
And just one more follow-up to that, there are different rules based residential versus commercial. And is that in our zoning docs? I didn't see an outline between commercial and residential in our flood overlay district.
So where you have that is four, where it says dry proofing, and then 2.5 where it references wet proofing.
Existing structures.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And are there differences between residential and commercial in new structures or only in existing?
There are. So let me look there. So in the NFIP minimum, for commercial structures, does apply to dry proofing is an option for new construction as well as well as, substantial improvement. Again, this is an area where I think the language could be made more clear, in the bylaws, I think.
But the current NFIB minimums would allow either of these dry proofing or wet proofing methods for either residential or commercial.
Well, dry proofing or wet proofing for non-residential. Historic structures have special treatment that could allow both. Residential components of a mixed use structure, like that Montpelier example, right? So it, NFIP minimum would allow. But residential space, dry or wet proofed below BFE is not allowed, and the NFIP has to be, residential space has to be above BFE.
Residential space or the entire structure?
This, in a mixed use structure, this space.
Well, if it's not mixed use, but it's residential.
If it's residential, then so storage below BFE, like parking, can be allowed in some conditions. With flood vents and other things, but like living room, kitchen, this is not.
And even though stuff that is in that one elevation needs to be done through an engineer.
Yeah, that is correct. I'm gonna go on. Do you have questions about here?
No, but you need like a genius to.
Yes. It has one right there. Well, that gets to the next option, I think, if it will. Next, okay. So, some communities do have a prohibition on all new development and fill within the 100-year floodplains. Jeffersonville is an example of this. And as are, I think, when you get into Chittenden County and Franklin County, there's more communities that have no build, no fill in the 100-year floodplains. And this is just simply, there's not new development is not allowed, and fill is not allowed within the 100-year floodplain. Something important to note is, in a community where you have a substantial amount of existing structures in the floodplain, it's advised that you have a process to address pre-existing structures that is clear and sort of accessible and understandable. This is definitely the more stringent requirement. It also means less need to evaluate like those complex plans and complex issues, except for where there are pre-existing structures. And then something else is some communities have begun to regulate a 500-year floodplain, which, as we talked about, is a larger event than the 100-year flood, and therefore a larger a larger area. NFIP minimum does not require any protection of structures in the 500-year floodplain. Once you're out, you're just naturally above BFE, and so there's not additional regulation. Those structures can be vulnerable in larger floods. I.e. July 2023 was somewhere between a 200 and 500-year flood in Lamoille County. And sometimes that may mean an all-out prohibition on new or substantially improved structures within the 500-year floodplain. Or it might require those structures to be elevated to the 500-year elevation or higher. It is kind of a local decision of what you feel if you want to go down that route. So then there's this historic structures. There's in Lamoille County and in Wolcott, there's quite a few structures that are both historic and also within the floodplain. The FEMA has different rules and actually different guidance for historic structures that kind of allows what's called wet proofing. So in allowing water to enter into the structure and do less damage and then flow out. Big things related to that are elevating electrical and mechanical systems and utilities using flood damage resistant materials. But in all cases, this means water is coming in, building, and then leaving the building. And that, different from the storage discussion we had earlier, that can include in some cases some living or space for human occupancy. There's quite a few examples of that in the Gulf region, New Orleans being a big example. One caveat I would say that I used to say until last October is that it doesn't snow in New Orleans. There's not as much ice. I was able to say that with a straight face until there was actually 3 feet of snow last fall in New Orleans. But just a reminder about a lot of the guidance from FEMA is based on the lower, flatter areas of the Gulf Coast. So they have to be thoughtfully adopted if they were used here. There were some libraries and other public buildings in southern Vermont wet-proofed after Hurricane Irene. Johnson considered wet-proofing the library. They ultimately decided to relocate it instead. So again, if you do decide to adopt regulations that prohibit new development of the 100-year or 500-year or require a substantially above NFIP minimum, thinking about how you're going to handle pre-existing structures can be important to that being functional and administratable going forward. And then the last item is the river corridor. And so this is a hazard area that was developed by Vermont. It's not part of NFIP, but what it really is designed to address is the fact that rivers move. And they can move quite dramatically and cause quite a bit of damage when they move. We all experienced that with Flatiron Road and, of course, North Wolcott Road, on a regular basis. And so the river corridor is a regulation of within that first mapping of that area where the river moves laterally, and then regulation of what can and can't happen there. Usually a prohibition on new construction and rules for rehabilitation of existing structures. Something that Linda asked me to talk about was new rules coming in from the state. Currently, the river corridors are adopted basically on a town by town basis or applicable for things that need to go through Act 250. The state, after the 23 flood, passed legislation that will begin a state program and a state permitting program for development in river corridors, but not within the 100-year floodplain. That will remain a local, the 100-year floodplain will still remain a local permitting responsibility.
I'm confused.
Okay,
So the state's gonna permit what then? If we're not doing 100, what are they gonna permit?
so they're going to permit new development within the river corridor. So the area that they've determined has that erosion hazard risk. Honestly, in most of Lamoille County, the river corridor is pretty similar to the 100-year floodplain. So they end up regulating that as well.
So they're gonna, so they are gonna, they're not.
They're not, their regulations will only relate to the erosion hazards. The towns will still need to be the body considering the flood inundation hazard. I don't know why they did it that way, but,
And so in most cases in Lamoille County, you would need both state and town approval because of the overlap between the corridor and the 100-year.
Yeah,
Basically, that's the wild branch.
that would be the wild.
The memorial doesn't really change its course. It's floods, but it stays within its banks.
Yeah,
They just don't want houses fall in there ever.
yeah.
Erosion, that's all they want.
When will this law be taking effect?
So it's currently to go into effect in 2028. There has been some discussion about pushing that back because of staffing levels at A&R. So I think that's it. So, yeah.
Is the state going to allow us to dredge some of these sandbars out of the Lemoyne?
So, so a couple things related to the dredging is that there are state rules for debris and sedimentation above ordinary high water. Are less strenuous than once you get below the ordinary high water. And a lot of cleanup did occur in some key areas where you can get more sort of state buy-in to some sediment management below ordinary high water, especially is when a community is taking a measure to remove a constriction. So often when there's a sediment bar, there's a reason why the water is slowing down and dropping at that point. And so what the state would say to the question about dredging is that if you just dredge without addressing the constriction, what will happen is the river will mine the banks upstream and deposit the sediment again, and they'll just be kind of racing against time and kind of undermining slopes upstream. Where they do make an exception to that is if you're doing the kind of modeling that LCPC has been doing in those constrictions and removing them, they're more open to sediment management as kind of an acceleration of the cleanup, because you're no longer having that dynamic where you have a constriction building up a debris and sediment deposit. that you remove and then it comes back because the constriction is still there. So an example of that was a good example of that was the mitigation work at the Brewster Lamoille confluence. One of the first things the town did there was removing some sediment upstream. And A&R allowed that in part because the constriction that was leading to that sedimentation was being addressed as well. So if there are, I think if there are major, major impoundments, though, that's a good place to look at what is happening in the river system in a big picture.
I mean, the most noticeable one is when you go down the rail trail and you get on the bridge, just as you start leaving town, if you look on the lower side of it, it's starting to mound up in the middle of the river, forcing it out into one of the banks on the left-hand side. So if that was put back to the original flow, it would stop that erosion and putting more sediment into the river.
And is that kind of upstream of the LVRT bridge?
It's below the bridge,
It's below the bridge, okay. Okay.
and it's a large amount.
It's above the Elmore Pond Bridge,
Yes,
so between the two
if,
bridges.
if you know where the cornfield is,
Yeah,
and then you have your bridge. If you look downstream from the bridge, it's filled in the center of the river. And I mean, it's quite huge.
I mean, you were at the training that they had in Johnson related to flood management, but state's more inclined to allow expansions of the floodway like corridor, like lowering elevation so the water has places to go out versus digging deeper trenches because they.
Well, this is filling in the middle of the river.
No,
So
what I'm saying.
I know what you're saying is to make it soil pond out. It's the soil that's come from that corn piece. It's dropped out, is now below that bridge, filling in the center of the river. And it's mound up 3 feet higher. That should be taken out. It's a sandbar, just like up on the brook up in North Wolcott. It's building up and making it go outside its banks, so it's eating and putting more erosion or causing more erosion. That center has to be lowered at least 4 to 5 feet to get it back to where it belongs, and that fill could be taken and used elsewhere.
Then you gotta figure out what's causing it to even fill up there, and is there a way to prevent that piece, but otherwise it just happen again, you know.
Well, it's just gonna keep eating into that corn piece until someone allows them to riffraff that corn piece, keep the sediment from coming in.
And that, I think the cornfield that's next to the old Nazarene church.
No,
No, not that.
it's across from Grimes Gravel Pit.
Okay,
It's eating into that corn piece, and then it's filling in below the bridge.
okay. So that's an example that bridge, is undersized for.
Well, no, the bridge isn't, it's the bridge for the rail trail.
Yes,
What I'm talking about, it's below it. It has nothing impeding the flow of the water. It's just the water slows down at that point and deposits all this fill into the main riverbed.
and it's the fill that's been picked up.
Right. And I think if that was be able to be taken out of there, it would help the flood situation a little bit.
Yeah, so looking at that and looking at, the amount of material above ordinary high water. Something that again, it's that going below ordinary high water is where you start getting a lot of concern from the state about undermining the banks. And the modeling can be used to look at things like, impoundments like that and what impacts there might be on velocity or upstream or downstream impacts for managing them.
At the risk of beating a dead horse, I have a similar question.
Yeah.
So Corley Road has washed in the last couple of floods and a lot of the roadway has ended up in the river. So you're saying that it might be allowable in the state's eyes for us to get in there and address some of that.
It might be, I think that you. It won't be just as simple of like, we want to go in with an excavator and pull it out and do it next Tuesday. Right? They will, the data from the modeling is something they will ask for that you'll already have, or at least the basis of it. And especially when you can point to like a source, like this is the roadbed from Corley Road, right? It's not natural erosion of the river. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I suggest talking to Chris Brunel about specific sites. And it's beneficial to get out there and look at them or take images and all of those kinds of things. Okay. Yeah.
Has there been any discussion, now that we're talking about Corley Road, about really looking at that stream and that channel coming down parallel to Corley Road to see if there's anything that could be done there to allow more volume of water to go?
In my knowledge, not yet. Monday may be able to correct me, but that's kind of where I was headed with that question was. I know that there is some issues, there's some landsliding happening, and then I know the road itself is. I mean, if you stand on the bridge and look down, you could see.
Oh, yeah.
Things like that. So I think kind of an informal question, but I am hoping that we can do something about it.
So I guess I'm wondering where we go from this point forward. I mean, I'm glad that we have this, are having this discussion and have the representation here, just, you know, so that we're all kind of on the same page about expectations. Because I know that, you know, we don't want to see the village become abandoned by any means. It's just a matter of how do we navigate it and do it in a thoughtful way so that we're not increasing risk by putting in especially residential structures within the floodway. Probably not using the right term now, but because that was one of my concerns. I think certainly, you know, brought a lot of this discussion forward is, you know, considering what happened in Texas where they allowed things to go into areas that, you know, the zoning knew about the potential flooding, allowed those kind of structures to go there and created hazards and ultimately loss of life. And we really just want to see us avoid putting ourselves into that predicament and taking on any kind of liability around that. And so that's why I'm just really hoping that we're being thoughtful and cognizant of the expectations and the rules around it.
I think that, you know, if the town did, in partnership with Elmore, receive a municipal planning grant to work on the bylaw updates required by statute and other local priorities, which I was fairly certain included the flood hazard bylaws. Like if the select board, planning commission, DRB, zoning administrator, emergency management director want to have a discussion about which of these, and I didn't need to go to Freeport, I meant to go to this one. You know, which ones of these are the most appropriate for Wolcott? LCPC can assist you with, you know, developing bylaw language. And that would be my recommendation is to, you know, figure out what works for the community, what you feel you can administer and what addresses the types of hazards that you have, and update the bylaws as sort of the first step to do that. And I'm happy to, you know, talk about these options more or hear your thoughts from folks on what seems appropriate for Wolcott. I'm happy to provide other information to help you answer that. That's a big question.
And certainly don't have all the board members present, but so I'm curious what you guys feel about some of those ideas, not like committing to them, but just more out of curiosity.
I personally don't have a whole lot wrong with what we have here already. most of the questions that I have received have been about a specific property, a specific project. And whether or not these conditions as they are have been followed. That all being said, I would love to see a little bit more clarity, you know, as we were reading through existing structures, would you say 5, 2, 4, and 5? You know, I think that there could be a way where. I mean, it wouldn't take a genius to read these, because you're right, you have to have a legalese mind to decide what applies and what doesn't.
Yeah,
So I would like clarity, but I don't personally at this moment know that I'm in favor of an all-out ban. Uh, You know, we have a lot of property that is riverfront. We're currently in town, you know, North Wolcott Village also. There's a lot. In favor of an all-out ban, I guess is the short answer.
I could see the first two on the top of the list. First new stuff, for sure. Freebird and sorry, storage.
We do have the storage requirements. I don't know that we have freeboard. Which, based on what you're saying about planning to the 500-year floodplain. You know, we may want to look into that and see if we can't go over and above the 100-year, because all of these regs are based on the 100-year flood.
yeah.
We could go over and above that. And require further protections, but again, not an outright ban.
What I've seen up in Hardwick along Route 14 by the Cary Road, if you know where I'm talking, down by the Dollar General and that, a lot of places now, they've raised them 4 foot. They're still there, but they raised them 4 foot, put a slab in, and now they've basically strapped the structures down. Tied them down. So they're out of the floodplain, but still where they originally were. I could see doing that to get them above the 100 and close to the 500 year. And you'd be fine,
That's
but,
what Claude did.
right,
It's not wrong.
yeah, he brought his up almost 8 feet.
Yeah,
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, if you look
yeah.
at the riverside, he puts 3 or 4 levels of those 2,000-pound bricks, tie them together and raise that. I mean, I can see him doing that, but it's like I said, most of this from the overpass over here down through to the Elmore Pond Road, there's areas that need to be riprap because that's just getting into the riverbed and filling it and causing a higher floodplain. And that's where I think we need to do that and dredge to get some of it back to the natural original flow.
Even still, that's outside of our control.
Right, but I mean, we could ask for it. At least it would help us be less. I mean, look at what Johnson did. They asked them, they allowed them to go below down towards Cambridge and blast out ledge. The flooding's been less because they opened up that riverway.
We have a big restriction, down in, I guess in back of the store probably, is it just a big ledge on both sides? A huge restriction that's causing a lot of problems. It's ledge, steep ledge.
So like, how long does it take the process of adopting updated? Like, if you guys wanted to go with the freeboard standard and, you know, set a value around that of however many feet, like, what's the process and timeline for even getting that put into place?
Well, it's an ordinance, so first you'd have to write, when is the grant, when we hear about the grant?
So the grant was awarded.
Oh, it was.
So really it's we have to do the administration of, you know, doing the contracting and getting that going, but we could start well, in theory, it could start next month. I'm looking at Conrad and thinking about, whether we can actually fulfill that, but,
And Max is gonna stand it.
yeah. I think that, yeah, that would be also driven by the planning commission's work plan.
You have a question, Maxfield?
More of a comment. So I appreciate the infrastructure improvements, freeboard, and all these flood mitigation measures on structures. But if there is an increase in residential density in flood zones because of these new measures, how does that affect emergency responders if there are more people than that need services during high water events? They are following the regulations, but it increases the density and the potential for emergency responders to have to rescue people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the additional concerns aside from just putting people into an unsafe situation is the capacity to respond to those things. I mean, we do what we can to try and warn people ahead of time when it's possible and, encourage them to not be there. But the same token, it only takes, one incident to tie up the fire department for a significant amount of time, and we have a minimally sized fire department. So, we saw during the 23 and I think 24 floods, like we become an island. Other agencies are not coming to support us during that time. We have to figure it out on our own. So that's why I really want us being as an entire town, just being really thoughtful about who we're putting into those areas and situations, so that we're not creating additional risk and hazards on top of it. And exploring other areas to develop in the town. I mean, we have a lot of other areas in the town that we should be talking about and see how do we, improve those spaces if we lose a little bit within the village. So
I think the bigger question you're trying to go for is how many people want to allow those areas to be developed? Because how many people are trying to conserve all that area and keep it from being developed? Because that's the only problem I foresee is areas you want to touch, or someone's going to put in conservation, you're not going to get anywhere near it and put a building prevention easement on it.
I'm just saying it's a bigger conversation than just this like one topic. Like, we're really focused on the village right now and how to kind of manage and address that. But like the bigger, broader conversation, just how to, as Wolcott, like how do we encourage development if that's what we're really looking for? So,
the other areas we would want to think about also are, we have other North Wolcott Road,
Yes.
house that doesn't have fallen river because it was built, because the ground was unstable.
Yeah.
How many more areas of town where you could theory put development are on a hill with clay on top of gravel or sand that's gonna fall in? That also you shouldn't be building on either because it's such a hill, so.
I don't want to get too far into the weeds on like particulars, but if someone builds up say they're in the flood area, the allowable, flood zone, build it. And they're going to build up the ground before they put the foundation on. Are there standards to what that ground has to be comprised of in order to handle floodwaters and such?
So that's a really good question. I'm gonna give it two part. The answer is, I think the important piece of the NFIP minimum standard and the state and how it talks to state statute is that you have the ability as a community to provide more detail in what's expected for conditional uses. So you could, for example, in addition to the NFIP standards, have a conditional use standard that says there needs to be an emergency response, plan or an emergency evacuation plan approved by the EMD or something like that as a condition of approval. I haven't seen a community do that, but it's something you would have the authority to do. There are not official FEMA standards for like the fill for compensatory storage, but you could, for example, have a requirement that the compensatory storage be designed by an engineer, for example, and it's stamped saying that it will actually be, be suitable, right? That's something you could do in your bylaws to address that concern.
Back to your question, I would hope that there would be a number. The public would be invited to weigh in while you're working on these changes. At least at the end, you'd have to hold a public hearing. The
Yes,
select board would have to hold a public hearing. The select board would have to adopt it. If they adopted it, the new regulations, then you'd have to wait 60 days before they would be approved.
Better part of a year to get through it, yeah.
the adoption process with the planning commission hearing and select board hearing period of time, you're usually advised to schedule 6 months for that, and then how much time it takes to draft. So,
And before, the towns, people would have to vote on that, but they changed the law. So
Okay.
now only the select board approves it.
Yep.
But the town can petition
Yep.
for a vote if they're against it.
Yeah.
Yes, I hope we can give some serious consideration around some of it as well. So boards move forward.
I hope more people would, come and give their 2 cents on how they feel about it. Or what they're looking for, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Go for it.
Max, you still have a question or is your hand still up?
No, I do. This is probably a question for Seth. With the discussions about, armoring and dredging and compensatory storage, how does, I'm sure A&R plays a big role. What we do has a significant effect on Morristown, and what Hardwick does affects us. How stringent is A&R in approving these projects? Because, anytime you increase the velocity of water in your township, it grossly affects the people down.
Yeah, so they are very, very conscious of that. And so for the stabilization piece, looking at options that mitigate some of the increased velocity that can come from stabilizing a stream are more likely to be approved by A&R than just straight riprap. So for example, like the constructed log jam type things that were done in North Wolcott, the J hooks that were done in Jeffersonville, all of those are more likely to be permitted. And Johnson did do some riprapping near Ledway Lane. They had to go through a fairly extensive Act 250 process that included looking at upstream and downstream velocities. It also included hiring someone to count the mussels in the sediment of Boom River. So it is a process to do those kinds of any kind of debris, sediment stable or stream stabilization. And I suggest starting with the modeling and starting with evaluating if the stream dynamics would support some of those alternatives like the J hooks or constructed log jams, because they are more likely to be approved by A&R.
Any more questions?
Mostly about our local zoning. Right, so we're in our current regs and our flood overlay 5B. Talking about the compensatory storage. Yeah, portions of floodway may be filled, blah, 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 blah. Would that require, and actually the other section that the same question applies to is 5B, three little i's, I guess, 5B3. Properly compacted, graded, whatever. Does that require an engineer or a surveyor of some kind to make sure that those things are accurate? Or can that be done on the good word of our contractors?
I will need to look at the current NFIP. Their language, on that question, it's another one of the aspects of this section that could be interpretive. Yeah, and I do think that the state has developed a new kind of outline of all of the things to meet NFIP as it's currently interpreted by the feds. That clarify some of those things, that as a first step, so clarifying when do you need an engineer? Who decides whether it's done adequately? What is replacement of an existing structure versus new construction? Better defining all of those things would be a really good first step.
Yeah, and the way I read through this section as well as 301, 3A, 1 through 5, 409, and 401. I mean, if all of this falls on a local zoning administrator or a zoning office, that's a huge position. That's a huge position.
It is.
I am hopeful that there is some clarity to be gained either through LCPC or through some state when we get to rewriting all of this, because if it is not an engineering thing, if we don't require engineering and it falls to somebody, it's gonna fall to the jurisdiction having authority, which is gonna be our zoning office, which is Tom. You know, that's a big role for you, buddy. You know, that's a big role for anybody.
I didn't have a decent map to this. I mean, there's certainly a part of me that wants to say, you know, like, trust your contractors and have them sign off on it. This is really complex stuff. So if there's a place for having Tom just see that an engineer has signed off on that adds expense for the applicant, but it removes some of the guesswork for the community.
Well, and Ryan, to your point, that added expense may discourage higher density in dangerous areas. But it still allows, you know, to me, it would allow for more examples of like what Montpelier did with a commercial space below with residential above. I mean, more better uses of, I mean, because they're not making more dirt, we gotta use what we got. But yeah, just thinking about, and not just you, but that office, once you decide that you're all done with us and you retire, how are we ever gonna fill those shoes? I'm here, I'm doing it, and I'm worried about that. I don't know. I don't know how one person would be expected to do that.
And then listen to them second guessing.
Yeah. Armchair quarterbacks. I'm guilty of that. I am one. And then I'll ask the same question I asked once before, just because I didn't write the answer down. I was too busy listening and now I forgot. One property out of compliance, does that put all properties out of compliance, or does that just put that property?
That just puts that property.
And that property being out of compliance does not disqualify other properties from other NFIP benefits.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the problem that starts to occur is people don't know all the ins and outs of that, and they just assume that, oh, hey, he was able to do it, why can't I? And then we're setting potentially bad precedents in some areas. And it makes it more challenging for zoning to have to address and navigate, so.
Right. Right, and I mean, optics are a huge thing everybody should be worried about. The state of Vermont, that's the Ethics Commission, one of their guidelines was if it looks bad, it probably is bad, don't do it. Well, you know.
I will say if there's a habitual problem. Like, and there's evidence that the community is just not. Doing what it's supposed to do, that could lead to, questions from FEMA.
Okay.
Um,
But on its face,
but on its face, one property is not habitual.
Okay, thank you very
Right.
much, Seth, and we'll, let us know, and I'll try to really advertise for the community to come out and voice their opinion on what they're looking for, changes if any. So the planning commission just wrapped up their town plan.
I believe so, that's right, too, you weren't around,
Yeah, I started reading it, but they've kind of wrapped it up. It's in the,
we're waiting for select board blessing so that we can get
Yeah.
public. Over.
we can move on to the,
Bigger and better,
yeah.
newer and different.
Okay.
Always told you.
I have less, yeah.
Just. The best. Not sure. Look at the bar, from your rebels. Somebody asked.
Somewhere there's an.
Something about the.
Sure, that was gonna do. This.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, Oliver.
Just to put it back.
See that.
Same with that, the old. fire.
Down.
Yeah, we put it right back where it was, you know, it's right next to the road.
Right there.
Yeah, no, I just, yeah.
I can.
So, I mean. I don't know, this like made me feel any better about the property down here at the end of the street.